I can see we've had a couple of people joining. Just while we're waiting for a few others, we'll give it a couple of minutes.
No worries.
So we're here today with our program. It's supported by the National Landcare Program. It's through the Smart Farm Small Grants stream. And this is one of a series of webinars that we've been delivering over summer that's looking at climate adaptation and projects around where we can support our landcare members to improve their on-farm projects to, I guess, assist in transitioning into this changing climate that we're in. So we've had some speakers in the climate space looking at long-term weather patterns and our forecast weather patterns. We've had a look in detail last week at the future impacts on beef cattle farming in our local area. So specifically looking at what sort of climate areas are going to shift. And today's session ties in really nicely with that because we're talking about the importance of managing ground cover, particularly over summer. Some of the other sessions we've had have focused on how to plan your revegetation projects to actually do some of the practical on-farm components like planting new shelter belts, protecting water supplies, enhancing farm dams. And we've also done a brief introduction to whole farm planning, which we've recorded as a webinar as well. So there is a really nice package of recorded webinars that we will have available for everyone, and they're up on our YouTube page, and we can provide those details to people if they'd like to look at those after this session. But yeah, so today is focused very much around the importance of managing ground cover. I'm just going to give it another minute and we'll wait for some more people to enter because we've got a number of registrations for today's session. So the format for today is we've got our guest presenter Damien here ready to chat to us, and we're happy to take questions. Happy to take questions along the way, or would you prefer them at the end, Damien? Or if people have them, can we slot them?
No, I don't mind. If people want to chime in during the presentation, that's fine.
Yeah.
Or if they want to keep a bunch of questions to the end, then that's also quite acceptable. But we're more concerned about the discussion we have around what we present today, and hope people go away with some learnings that they can apply on farm.
Fantastic. So if for those that are on the other end live, there's the Q&A button at the bottom of your page, and you can use that to submit your questions. I have access to that, and I can keep that flowing for Damien through the session, and I'll bring in the questions at the relevant time. And if they're not related to the content that we're talking about at the time, we'll hold them to the end so that they can be raised at the end for discussion. So that's fantastic. All right, well, it's 12:05. I think we might get started. So we've got the format for this session will be a presentation by Damien and then Q&A at the end. So firstly, I'd like to thank you all for coming on board today, and I'd like to welcome Damien Adcock, who's our guest speaker. So Damien's a research agronomist with Barenbrug Australia, who used to be known as Heritage Seeds. They have a very large research farm based locally in the northeast Victoria at Howlong. So Damien's got a really good knowledge of this local area. And prior to his role with Barenbrug, he was involved in soil science in the research space. So he's really well qualified to talk to us today on our topic of the importance of managing ground cover. So I'll pass over to you, Damien, if you'd like to share your screen, and I'll turn my video and mute myself. But if you need me, I'm just at the other end of the computer.
No worries. Thank you very much, Sally. I'll just get our screen up and running. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Yes, I've got your presentation up, so that's terrific.
Very good. So thanks first and foremost for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Not often I get a chance to delve sort of deeply into sort of soil science and the management of ground cover and things like that. I'm very much in the agronomy space nowadays, but it's always good to revisit what I was formerly trained in. So when Sally asked me to speak, it was very much about managing ground cover, in particular over summer. And I want to tie that in with the importance of ground cover to soil health and building resilience in your systems. Just before we begin, we mainly beef producers and smaller landholders, sheep and the likes.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary
Good cover. Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So this should all be pertinent to all of those things there, and hopefully by the end of today, you'll actually get a chance to take away and think about some of these things and how you can actually implement them on farm. So page down. Okay, not going page down there for some reason. Just hold on a second. It's not. Oh, there we go. Sorry, just a wee bit slow. So look, very brief overview of today, and I'm glad to hear that Sally mentioned that you've already had a little bit of an overview and a consideration of our changing climate. And what I've just summarised the climate predictions from the Ovens-Murray region done back in 2019. I'm sure some of you will probably have a look at that. Then we'll talk specifically about ground cover management and its importance and how it ties in with soil health. And then, depending on how much time we get, it may be a chance to talk about appropriate species selection and suitability of different pasture species given where these climate predictions are potentially taking us. Okay. So these are the climate projections straight out of the 2019 review for the Ovens-Murray region. So effectively, we're looking at maximum minimum daily temperatures will continue to increase, and there's quite high confidence in that. So more than likely, it will occur. And then in the next decade or so, we're looking at average daily maximums, sort of nearly 2 degrees higher than what they were in the 1990s. So slightly warmer climate, but with this comes rainfall variability or increasing rainfall variability over time. Now, the region in itself is always been subjected to quite variable rainfall in the past, but over the long term, it's expected to continue to decline. And most of that decline occurring during our peak growing periods in late winter and spring. Not so much in autumn, so our autumn breaks will continue to be variable as we expect, but that opportunity when we get to grow a good bulk of feed in late winter and spring may become more difficult with more variable rainfall. As we've seen this year, right across the state really, is that extreme rainfall events are expected to continue and become more intense off the back of whether a La Nina season or not. I think you've had some very good rainfall up there in northern Victoria on the side of the divide, not so much down here, but the challenge there is that we're going to have extreme rainfall events which, coupled with inadequate ground cover, will see the mass movement of soil. So erosion, rilling through paddocks, and basically a general decline in soil health, which comes with those things when you actually lose an amount of topsoil. So if anything, with all of these projected climate changes, we are going to have to be a lot more diligent when it comes to maintaining ground cover, especially over summer when these large extreme rainfall events are most likely to occur off the back of thunderstorm cells coming through. So a lot to consider, really.
And Damien, we just had that happen a couple of weeks ago. We've had a number of areas across sort of this mid-Ovens catchment that received 80 to sort of 120 mils in the space of 3 hours.
Yep.
And we could see the examples of exactly what you're talking about there. So you could see debris lines against fences where dry matter had been picked up, and you could see, paddocks with cover versus bare paddocks and how they fared. So I think we're already seeing that sort of extreme storm event this summer because of the La Nina. And I think it's really important. So you've nailed it there.
No. I think the unfortunate thing is that as climate change continues apace, the frequency of those types of events, whether it's off the back of a La Nina season or not, is going to become more frequent. So, more frequency, greater likelihood that we're going to see some of these events which lead to erosion and other things. But we'll touch on that a little bit more as we go along. So, look, just a little bit more about the climate, because I think if we understand that our climate is changing, and whatever you believe the causes are, it doesn't really matter. The fact is that we need to adapt to the potential changes coming. And we're in 2022 now. They reckon some of these will start, 2030s, 2040s. So some of us may have been retired by then, but for land managers, it's something that if we start acting now, because change does take quite some time when it comes to soils, we can better reinforce our current systems and potentially build improved resilience and capacity into our systems and its ability to actually deal with these changes that are coming. So just very, very quickly, and I'm sure some of you, from what Sally said, if you've already had it come across on this, I'll move through it fairly quickly. But the first set of tables there with the two of them regarding it's just whether it's medium emissions or high emissions. So let's hope the world gets itself sorted and we're actually in a medium emissions environment. But this is just some modelling that's been done comparing rainfall or projected changes of rainfall to the rainfall pattern that we saw 86 to 2005. Now, there were some variable events in that period of time, but it's still a good indication of what's going on. And we can see that line there where I've got, I'm running my cursor at the moment, is average, and we're seeing this shift away to this general decline in rainfall over time. And likewise for temperature, and you might be thinking, what has temperature got to do with ground cover? Well, a bare soil with no cover exchanges heat and moisture at a lot faster rate than something that has cover on it, be it dead or alive. So some of the changes are coming just demonstrated there. So what does it all mean? So rainfall decreasing, greater variability, more sporadic rainfall events that Sally mentioned before, and more intense rainfall events. The increased temperatures that we talked about are going to lead to increased evapotranspiration. So that's evaporation from the soil and transpiration from the plant, which ultimately leads to moisture stress. Now, don't forget that plants aren't the only thing using moisture in the soil. You've got your microbial biomass and its activity, which is determined really by moisture and temperature. But we'll touch on the importance of the microbes a little bit later on. The digestibility of your forages will decline as they're placed under stress. So that means that your dry matter intake by animals will change over time as well. Ultimately, your system will become less productive. And what we need to look at then is what alternatives do we have to our current or our typical perennial ryegrass systems that occur in the area, and we need to start looking at resilient deep-rooted pasture species which can actually provide feed into those periods. Just remember, as we spoke about before, that this modelling doesn't actually pick up on those extreme weather events, which will always occur occasionally. Unfortunately, probably with a little bit more frequency as we move forward. Hotter conditions obviously mean potential issues for the persistence of your pasture base, which means that there's a greater likelihood that your ground cover will decline over time as those plants thin and don't persist. So obviously we need to look at more resilient pastures to complement that existing pasture base, and maybe these provide the germ of an idea for some projects for the group moving forward. It's also about risk mitigation against drought. It wasn't that long ago that we had fairly dry conditions up that way. Oops, pardon me, moving forward too fast. But it also means that our growing season is going to change as well. But not only will there be variable conditions at sowing, later sowing dates, so that's the unpredictability of the autumn break, which becomes quite important when you're feed budgeting, when you're going to have that feed coming on in early autumn. We're looking at a shorter, more condensed growing season, which means that it places greater emphasis on our capacity to actually produce out of season fodder for our animals. So here we're talking about short-term crops, summer crops, if it looks like we may have a reasonable summer season, and the likes, and it goes on. So there's actually, we talk about climate change and we can sort of be a little bit dismissive of it, but when you actually take a step back and start thinking about all of the implications of that climate change to your pastures and your soils, it really means that you've got to start thinking about how am I going to manage this going forward. And the management of ground cover, as I said, is a critical component of ensuring the resilience and productivity of your pasture systems going forward. So what is ground cover? Well, it's a funny thing. It actually, ground cover, as I've said here, is just the percentage of plant material that covers the soil surface. It can also include sticks and rocks. It's basically anything that reduces the impact or the force of a rainfall event and can also decrease the speed of wind. Don't forget, rain is now only erosive force. Wind is as well. Obviously, 100% ground cover means you've got no bare soil, and zero ground cover is a completely bare soil. So I've just given a couple of examples here. We sort of moved from 5%, 5-10%, 15 to 20, probably about 50% there, and then moving right through to the last version is 100% sort of ground cover, and that's the sort of thing that we want to see after the autumn break. 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks after the autumn break, you want to see that sort of feed on offer for your systems. Obviously, if you've got ground cover like the fifth box there, or even the third, the fourth, and the fifth, you've actually got a reasonable amount of vegetative mass protecting the soil underneath. Okay, if we go back to that first example there of ground cover, lots of bare soil, and it depends on how you look at soil, but when I look at a bare soil like that, all I see is effectively a whole lot of resources that aren't being utilised. So if you don't manage it or have something growing there or persisting there, Mother Nature's going to do it for you. So that will be colonised by annual ryegrass weed, annual grass weeds, or broadleaf weeds. So that represents a whole lot of nutrients, a growing environment, potential water storage that you need to make sure that you're actually utilising, because if you don't use it, weeds and pests will. Okay. Now, it's not just farming systems. We're talking about annual and perennial pastures or crops. Native pastures or native vegetation plays a very important part in this as well. In particular, in those areas or those land classes which aren't really suited to more intensive grazing. There might be sort of occasional grazing. So hopefully we touch on that a little bit later, but don't just think that this is about introduced pasture species. Native pastures also have quite an important role to play, but their management is very, very different. You can't graze them as hard as you do a ryegrass pasture or phalaris or coxwood pasture. So like I said before, very much defined as anything that reduces that impact of force of those erosive events. And good ground cover, as I've got in that example just there, it's a lovely amount of standing feed coming into summer. It maximises infiltration, so your ability to capture and store moisture for pasture growth. Not just pasture growth, it's also there for microbial activity. And it minimises the erosion of topsoil and runoff. It takes an incredible amount of time, we're talking hundreds to thousands of years, to actually produce topsoil. The topsoil that we're farming today was formed a long, long time ago. But it doesn't take too much neglect to actually see that topsoil run down the hill into rivers, across roads, and that represents a significant loss to your business or your property. Insulates the soil against drying winds, as I mentioned before, but having standing vegetation, whether it's dead or alive, is incredibly important for the microbes which exist in the soil as well. This is the other thing that I was trying to mention before. I want you to look at soil as this sort of precious resource that has a hell of a lot going on in it. It's not just a medium for plant growth. It's a store of nutrients. It's the ability to store water. It provides a habitat for a plethora of different microbes, be they protozoa, actinomycetes, fungal spores, earthworms, beetles. It's a thriving thing that we need to protect and look after. Buffers against soil temperatures, as I said, because once soils get too hot, you've lost most of your moisture, and most of the microbes in soils tend to like things less than 65 degrees. They're not thermophils by any chance, and if we don't provide a way of actually keeping soil as cool as we possibly can, their activity slows and diminishes incredibly quickly over summer. Now, also, as I said before, it minimises invasion by annual grasses and weeds. If you can do that, you're going to save yourself a lot of need for spraying and the likes. It provides a food source for the soil and microbes. And let's not forget those things that actually live above the ground as well. I want to focus on those a bit below. So it's that habitat for all sorts of ground dwelling fauna, quails, anthracynus, all sorts of things. Okay, and just to demonstrate the point there, I've just provided a quick graph there which looks at the percentage of runoff. So this is moisture or overland flow. So this is water moving across the surface of the soil, and as it gathers velocity, gathers speed, it becomes a lot more erosive, and it'll pick up soil particles, sand, silts, and clays, and it will carry those off the paddock and potentially off the property. Now, I'm sure you've all seen a rill or the movement of, say, soil down a roadside. You can see here, once it slows down, it all tends to fall out. You've got the coarse, fine sands falling out first, which are mainly structural, then you get your silts next falling out, and your silts are actually a source of primary minerals, so your nutrients, your fertility, and then the last to fall out, because they stay suspended for so long, is your clays. And your clays have an incredibly important part in regulating the cation exchange capacity, so your soil's ability to actually store and supply nutrients to plants, its structure, and I suppose the strength and resilience of the soil as well. So when that stuff moves off your paddock, you've got a lot of work to do to rebuild it and capture it.
Damien, we had a bit of a question here, and I think it's a bit of a difficult one to answer, but it was, what's the uptake of the importance, like how many farmers are actually understanding how important ground cover is in agriculture at the moment? And I suspect that it's different depending on where you are in the landscape and maybe the aim of those farmers, whether they're large scale producers or hobby farmers. I think the answer would be quite different, but I'll let you've done a lot of field research, so.
No, I'll try and answer it. And look, you're quite correct. It all depends on the objectives of the particular landholder. Yep. Whether, like we can say that, you'd like to think that intensive land managers, intensive beef systems and dairy systems would be a lot more cognizant of the importance of ground cover. But there's always that temptation when you're short of feed to overgraze. And when you overgraze, that's when you lose ground cover and you open it up. Now, that's from somebody whose livelihood depends on maintaining ground cover. So it does happen. And then when you're looking, say, at lifestyle and small landholders and hobby farmers, you've got some who are incredibly diligent and almost zealous about protecting their soil and their pastures. But then, of course, you may get some who are sort of absentee landholders or don't spend a whole lot of time making what I feel is one of the most important things, and that's just observation, getting out and walking your paddocks and looking and seeing what's going on. That doesn't mean whizzing past on a bike. That means getting off and having a scratch and dig in the dirt. So I think it really depends on your motivations and what you're trying to achieve. So yeah, look, it's quite variable. I don't think there's any one particular I couldn't put a percentage on it, but I think a lot of it depends on those motivations.
Thank you.
But it really is all about this. It's about productivity of your particular operation, whether it's a couple of steers in the back paddock or whether it's a large scale beef operation or fat lamb operation. It's about productivity and it's about resilience. So how productive your soils and your pastures are and their capacity or their resilience to buffer against these climate changes that we're talking about coming. So being able to maintain that productivity in a increasingly variable environment when it comes to rainfall and temperatures. But those two things, productivity and resilience, are really determined by two factors, and that's your productive capacity of the soils, so your fertility of the soils, its overall health, and your management of your pasture base. Okay, and like I said before, it's not just introduced pastures here; it's also how you maintain your native pastures too, because they really do have an important role to play. You've just got to have a different mindset about how you actually use them. So good grazing management is all about optimising your pasture growth and its composition. So manipulating its composition. There's far too many, or I see far too many pastures which lack diversity. Okay, so they're just a ryegrass pasture. Occasionally you might see a little bit of clover and that's it. But I really do think for beef and sheep operations, and particularly for smaller scale operations, hobby farms, the advent of regen ag is starting to gain momentum, and I think from that a number of benefits will fall out of it. And if that means that we've got a more diverse pasture base, which is better able to deal with these extremes of climate and change, then we're always going to have some cover. Okay. And like I said, and you touched on that the group's done some whole farm planning. You've looked at some climate change. I think, Sally, you said you might be looking at, say, soil health in the coming months. But you need to consider your property as a whole. You can't look at a paddock in isolation. You need to look at how you're managing your animals, how you're managing your grass, and looking at and taking that all on board. How are you going to improve resilience to these climatic disturbances? So how are you going to set yourself for the next drought? Because it will come. It may be La Nina now, but the next El Nino is only right around the corner. As I said before, protect and enhance biodiversity. And what you'll find is if you provide a greater range of diversity in your pasture base, you'll also see a greater diversity in the insects that reside there, in the macrofauna, the microfauna, and so on. It really just does start to compound once you get some of these things right. And it's always very, very important to remember that you need to have an appreciation of the limitations and the condition of your soil. What is its capacity? There's no point trying to grow, a perennial ryegrass crop on a rocky outcrop of granitic ground that doesn't have any depth of soil or moisture holding capacity and it's low fertility. So be aware of the limitations and work to those. Correct them where you can, but accept them where you can't. I mean, this is where native pastures will be coming into it. There will be areas that you can't actually renovate the pastures. So how do you go about that? For example, when I used to do some work in Tallangatta, we had some very steep granitic country. We couldn't work. It was not trafficable at all. So we accepted the pasture base we had, which was mainly red grass and a little bit of kangaroo grass and the likes. And we used to put a little bit of subclover out aerially, and that was our pasture composition. And we were very careful about how we grazed that. So again, just being aware of the potential limitations that exist on your particular property. Now, what I've got here is just some examples of limitations that if you don't actually address ground cover early, these are the things that are sort of lurking in the background. if you do let your soil health decline to a point where, you all of a sudden you've got to deal with dryland salinity. So you've got ridge lines, rocky outcrops on the tops of hills which don't have any real cover, be it trees or some sort of perennial pasture base, which become recharge zones, and then they will cause potential saline issues downslope. Sedicity is always something that you need to be aware of. Does it exist in your particular part of the world? And then soil erosion as well. So these, if you've got these on site, it's actually there needs to be works to actually address these, and then address the ground cover issues. For example, with soil erosion, that's obviously when the soil particles become detached. And the reason they become detached is we've actually let the ground cover run down. We don't actually have, we've allowed soil organic matter to be mineralised. Microbial activity is very low. They're not providing those sort of gums and substances which help aggregation. You don't have aggregation, then you get poorer water flow. And they all compound. But one of the biggest culprits, though, for this is overgrazing. But if you've got salinity and sedicity on farm, then they require a slightly different approach to management. Okay, and it still involves maintaining ground cover where you can, but you need to address the underlying issues of salinity and sedicity. I think there are some examples of salinity in that sort of catchment area of yourself. There's definitely sodic soils up there. Most of your duplex soils that have been derived from, say, Silurian mudstone and clay stones and the likes, which are quite common in amongst the granites up there, will have a degree of sedicity. And then, of course, we compound that when we acidify our soils through normal agricultural practices as well. So really what we're aiming for is trying to control these drivers of land condition. So climate we can't do a whole lot about, except reduce emissions and things like that, and hope that we see, we don't see the degree of rainfall variability that you're talking about. You can't do much about landform and soil type. It's taken a considerable amount of time for those to develop, so you have to work with them. You can influence the plant type, and you very much have control over your grazing management strategies. Okay, and like I said before, pasture and soil condition is influenced most by long-term grazing management. So if you're looking at that picture there in the circle, you want the stuff on the left-hand side, standing feed running into summer, coming into autumn. We don't want this area on the right-hand side, which has been overgrazed. There's not a whole lot of dry matter and ground cover present. Now, if that was on a slope, then the potential for erosion would be so much more. And just to frame this in a little bit of economic context, is every autumn, one of my jobs with the farmers I work with down here is that we go and walk paddocks. And this is really about looking at ground cover and what it means for the coming autumn. So if you come out of summer with minimal ground cover, you can't expect a whole lot of feed to become available after the autumn break. You've got to consider how you're going to go about renovating your pastures. So this is just another way of using ground cover from the renovation perspective, not so much a cover. And it really is just an indicator of how much cover you've got. So those pictures I showed you before with typical percentages. Now, it doesn't have to be ryegrass here. This is just a slide that I've grabbed. It could be cocksfoot, it could be phalaris, it could be subclover, as long as it's ground cover, okay? So if you're looking at less than 30% cover in your paddock, so 70% of your area that you're looking at is actually bare, you need to consider some degree of paddock renovation, full paddock renovation, be that oversowing, broadcasting, or what have you. Then if you're lucky enough to see half of your ground covers there, you might want to oversow an annual ryegrass. You could oversow some other species, could be oats, temporarily or something like that. And then as you increase the amount of ground cover, the requirement for you to actually do anything is reduced. Okay, so if you're looking at 70% or more ground cover, you really don't need to do much at all. But let's put an economic context on that. So let's say your average forage yield is 12 tonnes of dry matter per hectare over the year. Probably a little bit ambitious for that particular area that you're in. And your ground cover is 40%. So this leads to a 30% reduction in the amount of feed that you're going to grow the following year if you do nothing. Okay, so that 30% reduction in yield equates to 3.6 tonnes of dry matter. And if you have to buy that feed in to supplement the feed that you haven't grown and feed your animals, you're looking at about $504 there. Now that dollar value there is based on utilising 70% of your pastures and paying $200 a dry tonne for hay or whatever feed that you're offering. So there's also a substantial economic cost associated with not maintaining your ground cover. Okay. And these sorts of things, and as I'll mention here, is you need to get out and actually measure, monitor your ground cover. Okay, so whether you're doing it in autumn, getting ready for the coming season, or you're doing it at the end of spring after you've cut hay, just be aware, have an idea of where your ground cover might be a little bit lacking. Now, these are just some examples before that I showed before. So here we've got very little ground cover, improving ground cover here, but still some bare space for weeds and annual grasses to colonise. And here we've got reasonably good cover, which will, after the autumn break, come away and actually provide a good bulk of feed. Now, the other thing I've got up here is usually we've got a quadrant over there, and you see these types of diagrams which allow you to estimate percentage of bare area. The largest circle at the top there is actually a diagram from an app that you can put on your phone called Canopia. So the Canopia app you can actually load on your phone, and what it allows you to do, it measures the reflectance of green tissue, and it will give you an estimate of the amount of ground cover that you've actually got. So there's a number of useful little apps there. Canopia is one that I use as well. And so it could be as simple as setting up a transect in a paddock and going along and saying, taking 30 odd pictures with Canopia and just adding up the percentages it gives you, and it'll give you a reasonable estimate of how much ground cover you have. There are a number of other methods we can run along with quadrats and do counts. A piece of 2-inch mesh, a piece of mesh with 2-inch squares, 10 long and 10 wide will give you 100 squares. You can pop that on the ground, and then you count either whether there's actually any plant matter in that square. So if it's bare, you don't count it. If it's got something in it, you count it. And then obviously there's 100 squares in that piece of mesh, and that will also give you an indication of where your ground cover's at. Right, just very quickly, oops, pardon me. Here, just really about grazing management tools. And the reason I'm mentioning grazing management tools is because they're going to have the biggest impact on your ability to maintain ground cover. So use appropriate stocking rates for the land type you've got and the pasture condition. Okay. As I mentioned before, monitor and adjust your stocking rates in response to the amount of feed you've got availability. There's no point putting a whole lot of animals out on a paddock which hasn't got a whole lot of feed, because they'll bear it out pretty quickly, particularly if they're hungry. So the challenge to you as managers, pastures and animals, is that you need to match your grazing pressure to the variations in pasture quality and quantity throughout the year. It's not a constant thing, it's not consistent. So you need to actually develop a skill set around how you manage the amount of feed that you've got on offer at a particular time. Avoid overgrazing in vulnerable areas and riparian zones. Don't go and flog out a native pasture on a slope greater than 3%. Keep out of riparian zones. It's more about water quality. And always try and maintain the highest possible levels of effective ground cover you've got. Okay. And by maintaining a healthy, diverse population of perennial species, actually goes a long way to actually maintaining the organic matter, soil biology, and allowing for healthy soils. And it's actually healthy soils are really the cornerstone of allowing you to actually grow the ground cover in the first place. So if you look after the ground cover, you're looking after the soils, and if you look after the soils, they'll help you maintain your ground cover. Obviously, if you're doing silage and hay, just make sure you replace what you take out. And just that last point there, it's a very fine line for having sufficient ground cover and not having enough. Generally, as a rough rule of thumb, 50% of anchored plant material, now it can be alive or dead. You can have standing stubble, and it will still do the same sort of job, protecting it from erosion and be it from water or wind. Generally, so that 50% cover will generally be enough to prevent erosion. Okay. Now, when we talk about ground cover percentages, and these here are some suggested minimums for pastures in southeastern Australia. But what I've also done here is just include a thing called herbage mass, which is also important. But another word for herbage mass that some of you may have come across is what we call the residual. So what amount of feed or pasture you're leaving after the animals come out of the paddock. Okay, is everyone familiar with that concept of residual feed or residual pasture? Oh, we'll find out when you ask me some questions.
Yeah, keep moving, Damien, on that one.
No worries, that's okay. So, an ideal ground cover is about 70% of pastures on flat, slightly sloping land. So here we're talking coming out of your riverine valleys and starting to go up into your lower slopes. And that's on what we call non-erosion prone soils, so those soils which aren't saline and aren't sodic. And ideally, after the animals have come out of a paddock, you've got somewhere between 800 and 1,200 kilograms of dry matter per hectare in terms of the residuals that are left. Now, what I might ask Sally to do for a future session for you is get hold of some of the old MLA pasture rulers if you haven't already got them, because these numbers here respond to those numbers on the pasture ruler, which unfortunately I haven't put a picture of. So as you looking or moving from sort of better quality soils to lighter, more erode prone soils here, so we're talking as you go up the slope and you're talking about, say, granite soils or very shallow duplex soils, you really need to have a lot more ground cover and leave a lot greater residual to protect those slopes. And then obviously once you get into the really steep hill country, which is probably a questionable grazing quality anyway, so here we're talking sort of slopes greater than 10%, and soils with very low cation exchange capacities anyway, and high acidity, you really need to leave as much cover on those as you can. So there's more in the realm of opportunistic grazing for those particular soils. So again, you can see here why grazing management is so important about maintaining ground cover. Now, talk a little bit there about grazing management and its importance to ground cover, but the reason that maintaining ground cover is so important is this question of soil health. Now, when we talk about soils, quite often people say, oh, soil's just dirt, but you need to actually learn to look at soil with a different set of eyes, really, and realise that it's actually has a physical component, a chemical component, and a biological component, which we talk about soil health or soil fertility. And ultimately, soil fertility is just another thing for productive capacity. Okay, so the physical part of the soil is that soil texture, the structure, its resilience to change, its ability to buffer from a changing chemical environment. The chemical side of soil is all about nutrient supply and cycling. And then there's the biological side of things too, which is your organic matter fraction, your microorganisms and the likes. Now, for quite some time, agronomists and fertiliser salesmen and the likes, we're focused very much on the chemical. We have a reasonably good understanding, I'd say a very good understanding of the chemical side of soils. In recent times, the biological component of the soils has actually gained considerably more interest. And the one that we tend to overlook is the soil physical side of things. But when you actually look at the physical component, soil's made up, an ideal soil is made up of 50% pore space and 50% solid. So that solid contains your sand, and clay, which all soil really is, and your organic matter fraction. And there's that organic matter fraction, which is really, really important for the cycling of those nutrients, because ultimately it's a biologically mediated process. And this organic matter is the food source for those microbes, but the microbes are also, when they die and break down, become part of that organic matter as well. And then your structural component becomes very important for determining your pore space, which is all about water and air exchange. Okay, without water, we don't get any activity, and likewise with air. But as the temperatures increase off the back of the climate change, we'll see a greater movement of water out of those soils, particularly if they don't have ground cover. If you've got ground cover there, then you actually slow down the rate of evaporative loss. But if you allow your soils to lose ground cover, then the threat of compaction and soil structural decline increases, and therefore your pore space will decrease. If your pore space decreases, your soil has less ability to actually exchange air or gases and store water. And that just then spirals downward, because once you've got less water and poorer quality soil, you're going to grow less. If you're growing less, it's going to become increasingly difficult to actually maintain ground cover. Quickly, soil structure. This actual soil profile here is from just up the road. It's the Springhurst area there. And here I just want to talk about soil structure a little bit. So you've got a little bit of organic matter up the top, and then it becomes bleached, not particularly strong structure here. And then as soon as we start to see a little bit more clay at depth, the soil structure improves markedly. Here we're talking mainly about a fine sandy loam and the likes. But good structure is important to soil and plant health, because it actually allows, like I said before, that water and air movement in and through the soil profile. It allows the storage of water and supports animal traffic. It allows you to get across it with a tractor. But more importantly, it actually supports microbial activity, and it's that microbial activity which actually ultimately allows soils to aggregate. And the reason that soils aggregate is these cementing agents can either be chemical, so aluminium oxides and things like that, but more often than not, they're actually biological. So they're the fungal hyphae, the actinomycetes, they're the exudates from the roots, they're the elements of microbial breakdown, which all supply to gum, which actually allows the sand, silt, and clay particles to actually hold and stick together and create an aggregate. More importantly too is nutrient availability. So here we're just talking generally about soil health from perspective of nutrient availability. Plants need a steady supply of macronutrients. Okay, I'm sure you all know about the plant essential elements. I think of the 17 plant essential elements of growth, 14 come from the soil. The other 3, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, come from air. So if you're not maintaining ground cover and you're losing clay, then you're losing your ability to actually store, hold, and exchange nutrients for plant growth. Okay, and also the importance of clay can't be actually underestimated, because clay, along with the organic matter fraction, are the 2 components of soil which are actually responsible for holding on to those nutrients. So they're responsible ultimately for your ability to actually grow grass. Okay, and these are the 2 fractions which are usually the first to actually decline once you lose soil cover and you start to see movement of soils. Okay. It's all about soil organic matter at the end of the day, from a ground cover perspective, because if you haven't got ground cover, you're not providing the organic matter that the soil requires to actually function effectively. If you don't provide a dry matter or organic matter into the system, there's no food source for the soil microbes. Okay, if they don't have a food source, they can actually turn over nutrients. Okay, they can't actually provide all those other elements to actually allow aggregation to go on. Okay, I'll let you read through some of the stuff here, but the decomposition of organic matter by microbial activity releases nutrients and for the growth of your next sort of plant. So one of the things that's going to happen if we start to see much more summer rainfall and warmer temperatures, the reality is we're going to see these flushes of microbial activity over summer, and off those flushes, once those that soil microbe biomass, because it's constantly turning over, it's living and dying all the time and releasing nutrients, that actually builds up underneath the soil, which actually has good ground cover. But if you don't have that ground cover there, and then you actually allow a large rainfall event to actually result in runoff or deep leaching, then it'll take those nutrients away. Okay, and you can learn a lot, and I'm sure that you'll do some more soil work. But you can see here these roots here, they've got the slight orange tinge to them, which actually tells me in these here that actually this soil becomes temporarily waterlogged. But the decomposition of these organic materials, which is effectively your ground cover above, is how favourable soil environments allow for microbial activity. So you get high decomposition rates occur when we've got warm, moist conditions, which we may see an increase in late spring and summer with the potential changes, but we still need good aeration and nutrients and a pH somewhere near neutral to actually make sure that microbial activity is optimal. And it needs to be free of toxic compounds as well. So here we're talking about excessive use of some herbicides and the likes. But this only exists underneath a soil which actually has reasonable ground cover. Okay. Likewise, just a bit more about soil organic matter. I'll allow you to read that later on. But it just tells you some of the things that soil organic matter is actually ultimately responsible for. And you can see there whether it's the supply of nutrients, improved soil structure, improving infiltration. So if we improve infiltration, then we actually allow us to store more water. So there's less water actually there for runoff. But just quickly, increasing soil organic carbon by growing a diverse range of perennial pastures and maximising ground cover levels is the best thing you can possibly do for your soil. We'll skip over water holding capacity. I've mentioned that there. A little bit about soil microbial biomass and what actually goes on. So it's not just about soil and clay and silt and sand and organic matter. It's actually what's going on in that soil microbial biomass. And look, just quickly, I know I've talked for some time about this. If you don't actually get out and monitor it and actually work out where the issues are, you can't manage it, and you won't actually realise you've got a problem until half your paddock's at the bottom of the hill. So getting out and monitoring your pastures and looking at how much ground cover you do have is incredibly important. But like I said, if you don't get out and have a look, you can't actually manage it, and you'll be actually you'll be reacting to these events rather than actually being proactive and trying to develop a system which can actually deal with them. Just very quickly to finish off, this can be a discussion for another time. Is actually about just choosing the right species for your situation. It's not all about the latest and greatest ryegrass. Like I said before, it could be other species that come into it, and they can either be semi-improved, partially improved, native pastures, and the likes. I'll let you run through that. There's a number of tools around which actually allow you to select what's best for you. So here you've got the type of enterprise. So let's say you're extensive, and then what type of summer you've got, your rainfall. You can either use growing season rainfall, either type of soil you've got, and then your pH, and then You go along here, and if you get 4 to 5 green squares, then it's usually a good choice. If you're getting more red and orange squares, it's probably not suitable for your situation. There are pearls of wisdom in some very old books. This is actually just a quick page out of the Pastures of New South Wales book back in 1956, and it's as relevant today as it was then. And what it really does is just give you a list of species that you could consider for your pastures. And as I said before, do native pastures have a place? Yes, they do. It's just about finding the best place for them and then actually changing your management practice so you actually allow them to thrive. Look, that's it. I'm sorry, there's a bit of a rush there at the end. A lot to take on. I understand and realise that. Happy to answer any questions via email if we need to take this offline later on. But ultimately, get out there, walk your paddocks, work out where you've got insufficient ground cover and come up with a plan to actually restore it. And longer term, think about the species that you're putting in to help maintain that ground cover over the summer, and it'll give your property the greatest possible chance of resisting these changes which are coming with climate change. Sally, I'll finish it up there. That's a lot for people to take in, I know. It's been
fantastic, David. Yeah, no, I think you've done a terrific job of really bringing back home to us, you know, the importance of ground cover. Really, it's around soil health and managing our soil organic matter. And with climate change and this, you know, change in rainfall timing and intense events, I think summer for us is going to be a bit of a key time that we need to focus on. I was interested just in asking a question. What do you think are some of the perennial summer species that for us in our area we could start to consider and look at incorporating into our pasture systems? If
the listeners and some of your members of your group haven't already done so, then things like phalaris and subclover pastures are very typical of the area and quite robust. The challenge with some of the deeper rooted perennials or other deeper rooted perennials that you consider, and here you probably could say intermediate and what we call Mediterranean type cocksfoot species. So they actually have a degree of summer dormancy. If you've got the elevation, you could consider a continental, which will respond to summer rainfall. But you're looking at these deeper rooted perennial species. So in the main, for their particular area, there would be phalaris and cocksfoot, which have relatively low seeding rates, but are quite robust once they're established. And the real challenge with those particular species is the establishment. They do take probably 6 months from autumn through to spring to establish when they don't offer you any grazing. So it would have to be a sort of a stepwise renovation if you're using those. You couldn't do the whole farm in one go. But let's not. Things like prairie grass also offer a space. You know, prairie grass and cotton usually grow fairly thick and wild along the roadsides in the area there. So, you know, it doesn't hurt to actually have a look at what Mother Nature's doing. The inclusion of, you know, potentially red clover may have a fit as a perennial. Subclovers definitely, they provide good amount of feed once the autumn break comes through. What herbs and forbs may actually have a fit? You know, does chicory have a fit? Possibly. Plantain maybe as well. So sort of a step away from the traditional ryegrass pastures. Because the thing is, once it gets to above 28 degrees, ryegrass stops producing. It shuts down, closes its stomata, and just sits there.
No, that's great. Thank you. And we will, a couple of other local land care groups are going to have some face-to-face events coming up where we're going to actually explore this and unpack it a bit further, which is good. I'm also interested, I guess, you know, you've mentioned natives a couple of times, and what do you think are the key natives that, you know, like we've got a lot of wallaby grass and kangaroo grass and weeping grass across our landscape, are they the sorts of ones that we would be hoping to retain or grow over time through management? Or are there better ones purely from a pasture sense that we should be looking at?
From a pasture sense, your microlina is probably the most productive.
Yep.
And does have the capacity to actually respond to summer rainfall events. Kangaroo grass, very tough and robust, as are the wallaby grasses. And then red leg grass, I think you call it red grass, we used to call it red leg grass,
yep.
Comes into the mix as well. The real challenge there is not to actually overgraze them. So it becomes more about opportunistic grazing. So ultimately, they're never going to support heavy stocking rates. But you'd question whether you should be doing that anyway. But really actually using native pastures for those landforms and those soil types, which aren't really going to provide you the return on investment of actually renovating a more traditional pasture.
Yep.
So they become, you're securing the area, maintaining ground cover on lighter soils, which are more prone to erosion and loss of ground cover. You graze them opportunistically when you can, and then you let them stand and set seed. Go from there.
And it does tie in really closely with your grazing system that you run, like, whether you're set stocking or rotationally grazing has a massive bearing on cover and preferential grazing of some of these species. So I won't hold us up any longer. There just was a couple of questions in the chat function. Audra asked about the use of mulch for ground cover, like using a straw or something like that. I guess that is, I see it as an option in smaller areas.
Smaller areas, a temporary quick fix, yes. But ultimately, as long as it's spreading out hay on a barren hillside is a good quick fix. And you may actually pick up a little bit of seed, like Yorkshire fold and other things out of it as well. But ultimately, you're only once that breaks down, you have to have had established a growing plant to get the best benefit out of it. So, yes, in a word. But if you get enough runoff or sheet or rill erosion going on, we've got a reasonable amount of water moving across, it's going to have to be a fairly heavy mulch to prevent that from continuing.
Yeah. And Audra's second question went back to earlier slides where you were talking about pastures under stress, that they don't provide the nutrients for stock that are required. And she just asked about, does that affect the sugar levels in those pastures when they're under stress?
Yeah, so if a plant is actually under stress and not not undergoing photosynthesis at its maximal capacity, then the amount of sugars it's producing is reduced. Yeah. And those sugars won't be moving through the plant because it's about supplying new growth. So you'll get sugar that you've got will be accumulated in that basal part of the plant. And that's one of the things that we've got to remember when it comes to basic grazing management, is it's about the mobilisation of those sugars, which actually allow. So when we defoliate a plant, the plant actually stops root growth, and then it actually uses that available energy to actually push out a new leaf. And once it's got a sufficient leaf area to start photosynthesis again, it recharges its sugars, and then root growth takes off again. The turnover of roots is very important. It's all getting that too, but a stressed plant, not as nutritious by any stretch as a plant that's sort of happy and healthy. And there are some crops, for example, sorghum, that it's not only the reduction in sugars, but when it becomes stressed, they produce a compound which is toxic to stock. So yeah. Also, stress plants, you don't spray stress plants because the herbicide doesn't take up. So, in a word, yes, the forage value is considerably less.
Well, that's terrific. Does anyone have any last minute questions that they'd like to add to the Q&A function? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. It's been a fantastic presentation, Damien. It's touched on so many interlinked themes and just shows me that we need to do so much more in this space to help provide people with the information and support to make some of those decisions on their farm. So you've mentioned some great tools. So I'll look for the MLA pasture rulers, the apps for the cover estimation. Can you spell the name of that app, please?
Yeah, Canopea, CANPOEA.
Great. All right.
And
Well,
like I said, relatively simple thing to do. And but if you're going to do that, you'd find some areas where you know what your ground cover is. So take a picture of a 0 area and 100%.
Yep.
And then just adjust from there. So a little bit of calibration, or simple calibration, but very quick, simple tool.
Yep. No, that's great. We'll get some information out to people on that, and the pasture selection tools as well is something I think we might explore a bit further as a group. So,
yeah, so there's a number of those floating around, and most of the seed companies will have some sort of seed selector. If not, I'm not too sure if the Australian Seed Federation has them or not, but they are about.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in for the webinar. We've gone a little bit over time, so I'll wrap it up, but thank you for being here. Thank you, Damien, for your
No, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
I look forward to, working more closely with you to get some of this great information out to people. And if anyone has other things they'd like to email into me, that's fine, and we can pass them on to Damien as well. That's terrific.
No, happy to answer any other queries that people may have afterwards.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.